Good evening, anarchists everywhere. I'm Ian Bone and welcome to Anarchism in the UK, where I interview ageing but growing old disgracefully London anarchists. Today I'm joined by one who has led a thoroughly disgraceful life from start till now. London autonomist, class warrior, pugilist and polemicist, Martin Wright. Welcome, Martin.
Hello, everybody.
Can you tell us a bit about your early life?
Yes, indeed. I was brought up around the Angel, Islington, a very rough place of tenements, a bit like a film noir background, really. Tough bars and pubs and dance halls and so on. That's what it looked like. A lot of poverty, Chapel Market, terrible place. A lot of people didn't have baths, outdoor toilets, no hot water. That was a normal situation. 20,000 on the waiting list. Schools were crap. Brutal places where you were caned, belted, slapped, tweaked by the teachers. And that was basically the education. That's what it consisted of.
Against that background, how did you discover anarchism? How did you come across anarchist ideas?
Well, I think I must have been a natural anarchist because I rebelled. By the age of 7, I had a vision on the road to Damascus, if you like, when I was about to have my first communion, and I decided to reject it all, although I had to do it inwardly, silently, otherwise the talk armada punishments would have been too much for me. So I was against the education that they gave me, and I was against the parental authority that I had, and it kind of started from there. I first declared myself to be an anarchist, I think, when I was about 13 in a discussion in the school. I'd confused anarchism with republicanism. I wanted to see the Queen and the royal family all executed and guillotined, and I thought that's what an anarchist was. The teacher said, no, that's republicanism. Anarchism means no law and order, no rules, no regulations, people just doing exactly what they like. The rest of the class, well, that sounds terrible, but I thought, oh yeah, some distinct possibilities there. I quite like the sound of that, although I would say that it wasn't until I was about 16 that I had a really good idea of what anarchism really was as a historical movement and as an ideology.
And where did you discover that there were other anarchists about and there was an ideology? What did you find or read or hear about?
I started reading about it in the underground magazines that used to come out in those days, International Times and Oz in particular. Had a lot of anarchist type things in them. I suppose that's where I really started to learn about it. And when I was about 16, 17, I started going down to Speaker's Corner, which is a lot different in those days from what it is now in the 1969, 1970, very different. And there was a lot of anarchists there. There was a lot of anarchist ideas floating around, and I met anarchists. I was probably the youngest one of them all, but I'd say that I was fully fledged anarchist by the time I was 17, by about 1970, halfway through 1970.
And did that lead you on to read the holy texts of Kropotkin, Bakunin, Proudhon and so on?
I read a lot. But I do read a lot. I quite like Bakunin, Kropotkin, Proudhon. I found them somewhat staid. Good turn of phrase here and there. But I enjoyed reading about the anarchist movements of the past. The Martinovists, for example. I read a copy of The Unknown Revolution when I was quite young, and I was quite impressed by the Martinovists. I was quite impressed by the Spanish anarchists. I wouldn't really recommend the sacred texts of anarchism to anybody. Any sacred text is boring, but I would recommend people to read about regional anarchist movements, historical anarchist movements. Very interesting, well worth reading.
And what was your first actual action that you went on with other anarchists?
I think the first big action I went with other anarchists was the 1970 protest against the American invasion of Cambodia during the Vietnam War. There was quite a few anarchists there, and I particularly went with them because, well, I would have called myself an anarchist more or less by then, but I was quite sympathetic to the Maoists, but that was only because they were extremely violent. But the anarchists were extremely violent, but quite clever about it as well. The Maoists got nicked, the anarchists didn't.
Yeah, the Maoists always wore white crash helmets, as I remember, which seemed to get pretty noticeable. And then I think one of the big things early on was the anti-National Front march in Lewisham, which must have been a sort of...
Yes, I'd got interested in anti-fascism just by meeting lots of fascists, strangely enough, down in Hyde Park, but also the Enoch Powell and Powellism and racism was pretty big in the workplace and on the street level, so you had to argue against it every day. when the fascists did start to get big and organised and march on the streets, which would be about 1973, 74, I started getting interested in opposing them. I was naturally anti-fascist, anti-racist anyway, right? But I did see it as perhaps as a forerunner of maybe more serious clashes on the streets that were to come. Lewisham 1977, I think, was really like a big turning point in the political history of this country. Very important it was. National Front got smashed on the streets, and the police for the first time had to employ riot shields. I mean, it's our national disgrace that the police had to employ riot shields in 1977 rather than 1968. But it was from then that things really took off, and I think that the anti-fascist struggles were a good prelude to the urban riots that took place in the early 80s.
And who was doing the fighting at Lewisham? Was it the ordinary punters on the street, or was it politicos? Or
it was local people, that is to say black people, and predominantly, but also a lot of white people as well, that opposed the National Front and opposed the National Party and the racist movements they were at that time, and a lot of lefties as well. I think it was a big thing for a lot of lefties. It went beyond, you know, the sort of rigid ideology of their party. They got to fight the police. It was quite exciting. They actually managed to actually do something to accomplish something almost spontaneously.
And do you think the sort of that confrontation on the streets, a la Cable Street and Lewisham, actually contributed to the decline of the NF at that time?
Oh, most definitely so, yeah. They were getting a bit too big for their boots, but they were able, thanks to massive police protection, to assemble and march on the streets. After that, it was more and more difficult for them. They really got a paste in that day. That was the beginning of the decline for them.
I guess the follow-on from that would be the Brixton riot and then the 1981 riots. What did you make of those?
Oh, I thought, yes, well, obviously, I was very, very enthusiastic about them. I was quite surprised that hadn't occurred earlier, actually. There was, this country seemed to be very, very slow in catching up with things, but once we did catch up with things, then, yeah, they were extremely violent and extremely anti-police, anti-authority. They could have gone along a lot further. If Thatcher had been in power for a couple of years, they could have become more politicised, but they were, but not in the way I'd like to see them. I'd like to see them become more insurrectionary. Although in Totstell they did actually become insurrectionary, but never realised any political demands. The left, of course, thought it was all about unemployment and things like that. It wasn't. It was about everything. It was about the police. It was about the crap education, standard of living, quality of life, just being at the bottom of the pile. And the riots of the 1980s were not just black people or Asian people. They were black, white and Asian. They were working class people, working class youth in particular, but whole communities as well, in an uprising against the system.
That's one of the key problems of our brand of anarchism, is how do you turn riot into insurrection? I mean, how could that have gone any further? It might be in the realms of fantasy, but can you see ways which things could have been pushed a bit further?
Well, yes, because in those days the left always stepped in. If anarchists have had a bit more confidence, I mean, for example, I'll give a very quick example. In Brixton in 1981, a lot of people were arrested, and there was a general movement on the streets that these people should have an amnesty, and there was a threat to march on the police station to demand an amnesty. Now, the Labour Party, who were kind of left in those days, and the left in general, stepped in and said, oh, no, we don't want anything like that. It could lead to further trouble. And the Labour lefts were all shouting, oh, it's against the British Constitution to have an amnesty and so on. Now, the so-called community leaders went along with this because obviously they didn't want to lose their position in the community to the insurrectionary youth. The anarchists at the time, rather than wanking off about what they did in the riots or didn't do in the riots, should have organised, should have stepped in and say, yeah, we believe in the amnesty, we want to push it forward, we'll march on the police station, we support the youth. But of course, as always, we went so far, but we couldn't go any further.
Yeah, I think it often happens, so that leaves the field open to sort of lefty community leaders to articulate the kind of rubbish reasons for the revolt, as you mentioned, like jobs and playing ping pong with the vicar and this, that and the other.
Yeah, I mean, the insurrections that occurred had absolutely nothing to do with jobs. I mean, obviously, a lot of the youth were unemployed, but there was millions of unemployed then anyway. So it had virtually nothing to do with jobs. The jobs were so shitty paid anyway that it would make you even more insurrectionary, even more angry to be living on £20 or £30 a week in those days.